Bonjour à toutes et à tous et bienvenue à ce webinaire.
Good morning to everyone and welcome to this webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sonia Krimi. I'm a member of the French National Assembly, and since last December I've had the honor to chair the Mediterranean and Middle East Special Group of the NPA. I'm also rapporteur of the subcommittee on NATO partnerships. Therefore, I'm particularly interested for two reasons in this webinar. I would like to welcome my colleagues of the Special Mediterranean and Middle East Group and to the subcommittee of NATO. I would also like to welcome Jane Cordy, Chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Democratic Governments. Greetings also to our partners of the MENA region and our friends who are here with us today. We have Mrs. Rafika Kasser and Mr. Abdelak Ben Boulaid, who are members of the Algerian Council of the Nation. Welcome, dear colleagues. We have Mr. Zvi Hauser, member of the Knesset and head of the Israeli delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Mr. Mohamed Azri, member of the Moroccan House of Councillors. It's a pleasure to have you here. And Dr. Bernard Sabella, member of the Palestinian National Council. It is also a pleasure to have you here with us, Dr. Bernard Sabella. And also, welcome to the various speakers that we will hear very soon. The topics we will hear today are extremely interesting and important to us. And I'm already looking forward to hearing you and your expert opinion and to then engage in an open and honest discussion. I invite the parliamentarians to actively take part in this debate. All you have to do is request the floor at the bottom right of your screen. Jane Cordy and myself will give you the floor as soon as possible. I will just like to ask you to be as brief as possible in your interventions so that more participants can take the floor. Also, please, I would like you to ask to use a headset with a microphone. It will render our interpreters' task. It will be much easier for them and it will allow us to work in the best conditions possible. So with the 2011 and 2012 uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, millions took to the street in order to fight against bad governance. There was a lack of social and economic outlook for the young generation, and there was corruption back then. And these uprisings that we labeled Arab Springs triggered expectations and filled them with hope. And there has been progress made, depending on the countries, of course. For now, they are quite small, but maybe back then it was a bit premature of us to call them Arab Springs. We will see later. Then, as of 2014, the situation has declined again in many areas and in many domains in our region. The initial frustrations behind these uprisings are still alive and kicking. There are still wars going on and endless victims. And today we have millions of deaths and thousands of refugees. I therefore hope that this afternoon we will together find avenues to be able to act and see what we can do at our level as parliamentarians. And this is something we have to keep in mind in this time of crisis. We can add our thoughts to what other governments do, because what we must do is to support our fellow citizens. We represent their voice in these democracies, and we have to help them in this path towards peace, stability, and democracy. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Jane Cordy.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for the update. And I very much appreciate that. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Good morning if you're in Canada or the United States. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today although it's virtual, and to moderate this first session of the webinar. And I must say that I will be really glad when we're all in the same room, because I think that sometimes our side meetings that we can have with people from other countries certainly add a lot to our knowledge about what's going on. And as Sonia just alluded to, the wave of popular uprising that swept the region 10 years ago, and in some ways it seems that it wasn't that long ago, it generated high hopes. And we can all remember at the time watching and saying that we hoped that this would result in a democratization. And the fall of long-standing repressive regimes was seen as a first step toward creating democratic and prosperous societies in which fundamental rights would be better respected by everyone. The initial euphoria surrounding the uprisings quickly gave way, however, to disillusionment, and unfortunately we remember that from the young people. And starting from 2013, democratic progress stalled and was often reversed throughout the region, with the notable exception of Tunisia. And since 2019, new protests have erupted in Algeria, Iraq, Sudan, Lebanon, among countries. As in 2011-2012, protesters are demanding improved economic conditions, better democratic governance, and respect for their fundamental rights. The COVID-19 pandemic, although it has temporarily put these movements on hold and has been exploited by some regimes to stifle any opposition, has also exposed the inability of these regimes to provide adequate services to their population. The dissatisfaction at the root of the 2011 and 2012 uprisings remain unaddressed, and the democratization of that process that started a decade ago in the region appears to be still ongoing. While this process must continue to be driven by the people, and I think that's very important, the Euro-Atlantic community would benefit from a better understanding of its drivers and its implications. It's morning here, sorry. That is why today's webinar is so relevant. I'm pleased to introduce two prominent experts who have agreed to share their insights with us on these topics. Our first speaker is Dr. Meha Yahawa, who will talk about the societies of the Middle East and the North Africa region and the enduring quest for change. Dr. Yahawa is the director of the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center, and prior to joining the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, she worked on initiatives addressing the challenges of democratic transitions in the Arab world at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. And thank you very much for joining us today. And our second speaker is Dr. Luis Martinez, who will talk about the Tunisian case. Dr. Martinez is a research director at the Center for International Studies at Sciences Po in Paris. He is a specialist in democratization in the Middle East and the North Africa region, and he published a book in 2019 on the state of North Africa after the Arab Uprisings. And last night when I was researching on the internet, I also discovered, Dr. Martinez, that you spent some time in Montreal, Canada. And it is indeed a pleasure to have you with us this morning as well. I will give each of the speakers, they will speak consecutively and for 15 minutes each, and then we will have a time to have a dialogue among all the members who are online. So we'll start with you, Dr. Yahaya. Go ahead.
We seem to be having a problem with Dr. Yaya. There she goes. Okay, so she's requested the floor. We'll give you the floor in a second. Here we are. Should work now.
Can you see me and hear me?
All good.
Okay, excellent. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Depending on where you are around this globe. Thank you for the introduction, but also for inviting me to be part of this discussion today. I'm going to speak a little bit about where things are with the region. Already we've had a taste with the two introductions, the two speakers that preceded me. But perhaps just to say that today in the region, the COVID-19 pandemic is really the fourth major crisis to hit the Arab region in the last decade. The first three we already know, which is the 2011 Arab Uprisings and all the repercussions of the Arab Uprisings, basically the triggers that led to them, but the repercussions. The 2014 to 2016 decline in oil prices, and then the 2019 protests in Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon, which were a kind of continuation of the 2011 Arab Uprisings. This latest, all of these collectively, the first three crises really shook the foundations of the old Arab order. They shook it, but the old Arab order has not collapsed yet. But I think it's on its way, not to collapse, but definitely significant change is on the way. Now, this latest crisis in terms of COVID-19 has really brought into sharp focus the structural inequalities that have been afflicting the rentier economies of the Middle East and North Africa. It's also compounding problems in conflict-affected countries where political and military actors are weaponizing both this public health emergency. With global economic downturn, inequalities in health, education, and economic opportunity are likely to pose even greater difficulties for Arab states and may trigger significant upheavals down the road. We're already seeing this in a number of countries in the region, the last of which is Jordan, where people have taken to the street over the past 2 days. And triggered by the lack of oxygen in one hospital, which unfortunately led to 6 deaths. But this is just the match that lit an already agitated population as a result of significant inequalities, a growing gap between haves and the have-nots, etc. And we see this pattern across the region. Now, the transition to stability
We seem to be having technical difficulties with Dr. Yahya. We'll wait for a second to see if we can get back her on screen. Otherwise, we will, if we cannot do that, then we'll go to Dr. Martinez, I suppose, and then potentially try to get Dr. Yahya back on screen later on.
Hello?
Oh, here we are. Sorry, we lost you for a second.
Sorry.
We can hear you now.
Shall I continue?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So the central question is not whether the old Arab, which is based largely on authoritarian governments and tier economies, can survive the pandemic. It's whether Arab leaders will finally make the kind of policy decisions necessary to get ahead of, a wave of change that is coming, whether they want it or not. Now, before I continue with the kind of fallout that we're looking at, let me just move to a 35,000 feet, if you want, vision. This is a region that also has been going through considerable change on the geopolitical and geoeconomic level. The bilateral peace settlements that have been struck between Israel and a number of Gulf countries leave larger questions, and we can talk about these unresolved. There are expanding conflicts and more fragile states, both political and economic. Lebanon, where I am today, is one example of the increasing fragility in the region, even though Lebanon has its own problems. Syria as a country will continue being a global destabilizer unless there is some sort of a political settlement that takes into account the safe return of refugees, the return of displaced populations. We're talking about almost 14 million people between those internally displaced and those who were forced out of their country. But that also has a measure of justice at the center of it. And here I just want to stop for a second and emphasize the whole issue of impunity, because without some sort of accountability at the end of a settlement in Syria, but also at the heart of governance systems across the region, we are only likely to see increase in authoritarian systems Already some of these countries are trying to take advantage of the pandemic to increase surveillance, amongst other issues. Also, the regional competition as a result of the post-Pax Americana has triggered the sort of, if you want, of foreign policy. Each country is acting in and of itself based on its own interests. And this is quite visible in, in the region really is dominated by regional rivalries, not only international rivalries. Turkey, Iran, the UAE are involved in a number of conflicts in different places, in addition to Russia and the US and others. So the bottom line is that this is a conflict-ridden region. There are a number of collapsed states within a broader global disorder, and hopefully now with the Biden administration, the election of the Biden administration in the US, there would be a return to some sort of multilateralism in dealing with global challenges, both political, military, as well as health, as we see at this point. In terms of where to move forward from this, and I'm not going to go too much into the details of the legacy of the Arab Spring, but I would like to just say, in terms of moving forward, this is a historic turning point, one that will last a long time. It's not something that will happen overnight, and that without proper governance systems, the kind of the fundamental inequalities, we're likely to see more unrest, in part because inequality is increasing, not decreasing in the region. Political exclusion is decreasing, not increasing. Political exclusion is increasing, not decreasing. The demonstrations and the social movements that we've seen in different parts like Iraq or Lebanon or Algeria have not yet been able to recuperate or to force a transition. And quite honestly, I think it's unfair to them to think that they would be able to force a transition in their different countries. They're coming against significant forces, entrenched forces. The counter-revolutionary forces in all these countries are very strong. Some of them are armed. Some of them, in places like Algeria, it's mainly the army. So the hope that these young protesters are able to force a change, I think, is placing too much of a burden on them. They do need to be supported. We're already seeing a movement in places like Lebanon towards the establishment of new political parties that are national in nature and not necessarily sectarian. However, this will take time. This is a region where politics became a dirty word and where the political sphere was completely demolished by the previous regimes. So this will take time. And I think this is where perhaps European and other Western countries can play an important role in continuing to actively support these movements in a number of different ways. Now, for the Arab region, I'll just talk about 5 maybe clear areas that I think Arab governments need to invest in for the region to be able to move forward. It's a tall order. I'm not pinning my hopes that they will actually do it, but I don't see any other way for this region to move forward. The first is that our Arab governments really do need to invest in their people before it's too late. Social peace will not be achieved by force, nor through financial incentives, which is what the old social contract was based on. There needs to be a building of new and stronger institutions and the rethinking of the social contract between states and citizens on the basis of equitable citizenship. The 5 areas where we can see, or it's important that we see, one is inclusive decision-making, i.e. in places where Arab citizens are included in the decision-making and in the governance of their societies. And this is partly because Arab states really have very little trust in their governments, and they see very high levels of corruption and inequality of that corruption. And the only way to recuperate that trust is by building institutions and including citizens, giving citizens the credible voice in the way things are run. The second area, I think, where there needs to be significant change is education for active citizenship. The sector of education, I know it's not often discussed, but if you want to prepare citizens to function in the 21st century, a rehaul of the education systems is fundamental. Not only in terms of the quality of education, it's not only in terms of adding rote learning to critical thinking, but also in terms of what kind of economy we're looking at in the 21st century. Students today are simply not prepared for any of these things. Perhaps the third area is that as Arab countries move away from a welfare state model, particularly because in oil-producing countries, they're no longer able to sustain, and we're already sustaining high levels of payments that they were making. We're already seeing this in a number of countries that are cutting down on the generous subsidies for other that they don't throw the baby out of the bathwater, that they do maintain support, education, health, etc. However, for example, the issue of jobs for in public sector to be done has already been cut down. The previous promotion of a culture of no taxation and no representation is going to happen. If you're going to tax people, they're going to demand some sort of representations. So there needs to be a more inclusive economy which operates under greater fiscal constraints. And without these inclusive economies that provide essential health, education, transportation at reasonable prices, shouldn't be, for example, providing jobs and subsidizing commodities. There are other, specific policies that one can discuss in terms of how you build human capital, how do you promote transparency, limit subsidies, etc. I think these are all important aspects of a more inclusive economies in the region that allow the economic, any kind of future economic growth to be more evenly distributed amongst the population. Finally, the nurturing pluralism. I think it's quite important that, this region is one of the most ethnically and religiously plural region in the world. It's not just about the three Abrahamic religions, but the diversity includes a lot of ethnicities that actually, unfortunately, were introduced to the world through, for example, the atrocities of ISIS, talking about the Yazidis, the Baha'is. There are multiple ethnicities across the region in countries like Iraq and Lebanon and other places. And I think this diversity is one that should be celebrated, and it should be a source of strength. And this can only happen that if all communities are given the same rights, both political, social, and economic, ways that allow these communities and individuals to share in prosperity. The other aspect, I think, which is fundamentally important when it comes to the population, today the greatest share of the world's refugees and internally displaced people are from the Middle East and North Africa, even though the region accounts for only 6% of the global population. And as a result of conflicts, it's losing decades of development gains. Sorry, I'm not sure why my camera keeps turning off, but
sorry, just to let you know, I didn't want to interrupt you. We turned off the camera because the sound wasn't very good, and there isn't enough bandwidth. But when the camera's off, it's working much better. That's why we turned it off. Sorry.
Then keep it off. Keep it off. Okay. Then that's fine.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Anyway, I was done. So basically, a more No, no worries. So basically, a more inclusive societies as well, I think, is quite important. And finally, some sort of regional cooperation, which I think is probably also quite a long shot in the current situation, unfortunately. I mean, there have been countless studies since the 60s and 70s and 80s that show that regional cooperation and on the economic front alone would benefit everybody in the region. And unfortunately, this has not happened. Given the conflicts that we see today and the involvement of countries, I mean, countries in the region, particularly countries like the UAE and Turkey, in addition to Iran's adventures, I mean, the involvement in each other's affairs, the role of spoilers that they've played across the region will undermine any potential for regional cooperation. But frankly, without regional cooperation, I think the region is losing out on a lot in terms of prosperity for everybody. And what happens in one part of the region simply does not stay in one part of the region. It actually doesn't even stay in the region, as we saw with the refugee crisis, but has the potential to the potential for its destabilizing effects is there to go far beyond where it is today. I'll stop right here and I'll wait for the Q&A and we can discuss a bit further some of the issues I've put on the table.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yahala. That was a tremendously thorough analysis of what's happening in the region, and I'm sure people have lots of questions already. But before we go to questions, we will now hear from Dr. Martinez, who is going to share with us his presentation. So Dr. Martinez, you have the floor.
Bonjour.
Oh, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. All right, great. So thank you for inviting me to this discussion on the topic of 10 years after the Arab Spring and the Arab Uprisings. I'm going to try in about 15 minutes to present the broad strokes of the Tunisian case and its contributions, and also the questions, the limits, and the concerns about the future. And if the state and the government stay as they are. Let's not forget that Tunisia is the only country in the region to have managed to peacefully carry out its transition from an authoritarian regime to democratic institutions. It's important to recall that because, as my colleague pointed out, this sort of experience is relatively uncommon, if not outright rare, in the region. So this institutional change towards democracy has, as it turns out, met some of the expectations of the Tunisian Revolution, be it in terms of a demand for more freedom of association, of representation. But at the same time, this institutional change has also meant a great deal more political instability. I think there have been over 9 prime ministers in 10 years, which shows the learning process for democracy that Tunisia is going through. And at the same time, we've also seen, and I think that was very important for the rest of the Arab world, a compromise in 2014, which led to a new constitution and which brought together Islamists and Democrats who found a compromise in order to be able to live side by side politically. We know that historically in the 1980s and 1990s, there were tremendous differences between these different parties. And today, with the 2014 constitution and the Tunisian experience, we can see the result of this shared acceptance that the political field and democratic society also mean having the contribution of Islamist parties who of course also accept that democracy is a legitimate system. So these democratic steps forward have been quite major, and they were already underscored quite often. But let's also not forget that since 2018, we have seen in Tunisia what you might call a gradual disillusion, political disillusion in particular. If I gave you the figures for electoral participation in municipal elections for 2018, they don't even reach 35% of the electorate, which is surprising in a country that fought for freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of elections. And despite that, local elections only got about, and not quite, 35% of voters turning out. And what's more, things are happening through the victory of an independent candidate who is not associated with any political party. The electorate has voted for an independent, a university professor, and who clearly said that he was not associated with any party, as if the political parties in Tunisia had somehow, since the revolution, had to pay for the sense of disillusionment of voters, as if the political class as a whole had not managed to meet the expectations of voters. And it's important because this was something that was pointed out in the beginning. When you have a revolution, the expectations are limitless for revolutions. Revolutions give rise to hopes and expectations and a sense of euphoria, which must be satisfied and met in the short term. And the Tunisian Revolution has been very different from other countries that engaged in reforms. Morocco, for instance, has been implementing structural reforms over decades, and the results are lengthy and slow and not always visible, but has not led to immediate expectations for change either, contrary to Tunisia, which had a revolution. Now, part of the political class was in the opposition, Islamist or democratic opposition, but nevertheless, it was very disappointing, and its performance was very disappointing to those involved in the regime change, not only due to the lack of improvement of lifestyles and standards of living, but also of social and economic situations. Going back to what Hakim Hamouda said a couple of years back, the revolution made it possible to have regime change, but it did not change the structure of Tunisia's economy. It has stayed a prisoner in some way to a model which today has been left behind. It's a model that is based on simply 4 industrial sectors: a low-cost industry with low wages, and which made it possible in the fields of agriculture and tourism, perhaps, as well as for services, to get a certain level of stability over some decades. However, since 2020, that economy has stayed almost set in stone. The Tunisian Revolution has not had much impact on the Tunisian economic system. And that economy has borne the full brunt of the crises that my colleague mentioned before, which have weakened the Tunisian system. Let's recall the terrorist attacks and the pandemic, which of course have hit hard a sector which accounts for 15% of the GDP. We're also looking at a country which has not managed to do much beyond outsourcing and has not managed to get sufficient rooting in, to make the Tunisian economy sufficiently appealing to get more businesses to set up shop. What we find in Tunisian society is unemployment nearing 20%, 18, 19, but we're pretty close to 20% of the population that is unemployed, often without getting unemployment insurance. It's important to point that out. And we have young people who represent 25% of the population, who are between 15 and 29 years old, and 35% of these young people are unemployed. This is also one of the results of the revolution. 10 years later, 35% of Tunisia's youth are unemployed, which means these changes have, of course, provided Tunisia with the freedom that was expected. It has made it possible to have democratic institutions, a fight against corruption, an improved level of governance. But the fact is that for the most marginalized populations, for those living in the most precarious situations, and for those who are the least integrated into Tunisian society, democracy has not met the expectations that they had and that they expressed during that revolution. What's more, the Tunisian state, despite, I'd say, its new political system and regime, has also not managed to find the economic and financial improvements at an international level, or nor help at an international level that it expected, perhaps legitimately. The Tunisian state has weakened gradually. The security sector reform, for instance, by definition, has led to a bit of a gap in 2014, 2015, 2016. But most of all, we saw the Tunisian government provide as the single alternative to the economic crisis to join the civil service. Between 2011 and 2014, Tunisia hired over 180,000 new civil servants. That is a huge figure when you look at the population level. And it's important to point out that today 50% of public expenditures are dedicated exclusively to paying the salaries of civil servants, which also means that the Tunisian state's maneuvering room is structurally very limited. There are no longer sufficient resources to invest, to create new sectors of activity that might build towards the future and that might grow and lead to new professions. So we have a government reaction, which in fact is a political reaction, often something that is simply trying to pacify voters. Often politicians will answer the expectations of their electorate by creating this type of job, these types of jobs, in order to try to calm the ire of the population and their expectations since the revolution. So Tunisia is an extremely interesting country for all of those interested in the transition process, the political transition in particular, in the region. And I think there are 3 points that it raises that are very important. A purely political revolution is unable to meet the expectations of a society. We have to leave behind the revolutionary illusions we had about 10 years ago that led us to believe that a regime change would simply solve all of society's problems. All that will lead to is creating expectations in our societies which will be extremely hard to meet. We have young societies. Everyone is not simply hoping to become a politician or a trade unionist. Many young people simply want to have a job, to be able to pay for housing. And I think we need to be able to meet those expectations. If revolutions do not meet those needs and those expectations, then societies will react in their own way, which means they will gradually shift again towards authoritarian regimes, which will find some solutions to submit. And we've raised the issue of security. Security has been one of the key aspects of the legitimacy of the state. A government that cannot protect its society is the subject of intense criticism by the society. But it's the same for social and economic activity. A government unable to provide not just jobs, but the social and economic conditions that allow for the society to create jobs will clearly be endangering itself, because the society is going to be more and more wary of the government. The second point, which is very important and which we could draw as a lesson from this experience,
eh bien, c'est le fait que, bien évidemment,
it's the fact that revolutions have raised a lot of hope in terms of society changing, but there again, the transforming a society takes time. We can't change a society because we just change political regimes. It takes time to change societies, and there you need structural investments. It's education, it's the media culture, it's the economic culture for innovation. There are a series of instruments that can be used by Euro-Atlantic partners to help some of these countries, and Tunisia in particular, to develop these aspects. And the third point is related to Tunisia's foreign policy. Unlike its neighbors, whether we're talking about Algeria or Morocco or Libya, it's a very small market if we compare it to its neighbors, and it's a country that needs to open up in order to function and to live. And it hasn't opened. We have a country with a democratic experience, but that is not part of the EU, which is part of the Arabic Union. But for example, the speaker of the Tunisian parliament said that maybe there could be a mini Maghreb with Algeria and Libya. I don't know if that's the right answer, but we can see that one of the requests coming from Tunisia, if its economy doesn't open up to foreign investments, if there's no trade in terms of capital and even people, then the Tunisian economy will have a lot of trouble moving away of its current model, which is not adapted to meeting the structural requirements of our society. And I think we can see how we can enhance the regional integration of Tunisia, how we can enhance the regional integration between Europe and North Africa, and how to help North Africa, and maybe we can even develop markets in sub-Saharan Africa. I believe that it's important to open up these countries, but if 10 years after the political revolution in Tunisia, if we don't meet the social aspirations of the Tunisian people, we are creating the conditions for a political regression over the next decade and complete disillusionment. These young people who had massively invested themselves in changing their own regime will see that migration may be the only option for a better future. And I'm not even talking about these 5,000 to 6,000 youth who joined Islamic State, who hoped for a better future in the 2010s. Migrating in order to have a better future shows that the revolution has failed. So I'm coming to the end of my 15-minute slot, and I'm going to stay here I'm going to stop here in order for you to have time to ask questions, and please free to ask me any questions you wish.
Inez, that was very, very helpful to all of us. If you have a question, on your right-hand side, you'll see a request list. And so put your name on the request list. And our first, for either a question or a comment, it doesn't have to be a question. And our first person to speak today is Colonel Bob Stewart from the United Kingdom. Go ahead. You're on mute. You're on. Oh, there you are.
You muted me, you devils. You kept me quiet. Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you both doctors. Very, very interesting. We are very grateful for your time. Listen, people like ourselves in NATO countries spend hours, days, weeks, months lecturing countries of Middle East and North Africa on how to be more democratic. Now, these are very proud countries. They're nationalistic. Their histories certainly go back beyond that of the United Kingdom, and Jane, well beyond Canada's recent Western European type history, not if you include, the ethnic people that lived there, who were there from time immemorial. So we are lecturing people who are nationalistic with very proud histories, and I don't blame them, being somewhat resentful when people that have got a colonial, like the French and the British, and possibly the Spanish in this area, and other countries too, come in and tell them how to run their affairs. And in a way, I totally understand that. So we're left with we're not actually achieving much. We send money, we go and lecture people and tell them how to do it, and they look at us and they say, well, thanks very much, goodbye, very nice to see you, and away they go. So we're left with what? The United Nations. Now we've got the United Nations. Now I am an ex-United Nations commander, and I am a supporter of the United Nations with all its faults, and my goodness, it's got a lot of them. A lot of faults, the United Nations. But the one thing it does have the authority of, it has the authority of being the forum of the world's opinion in the General Assembly. But if we use the United Nations to try and help democratization, I have a problem with it, Jane, too. It's a big word for me. I'm an infantry officer. You know, how does the United Nations lead in this matter when two members of the Security Council, and the permanent members of the Security Council, that's actually 40% of the Security Council, that was a slip of the tongue. I'm so sorry, Sonia. I didn't mean France as an enemy, but I meant China and Russia are so blatantly anti-democratic. How the heck can the Security Council and the United Nations help? So my question is probably to Dr. Yahya first, but then Dr. Martinez might have a feeling on this too. My question, I'm getting to it. I'm so sorry. I'm a long-winded man. My question is, what the hell can NATO countries do to help Middle East and North African countries get more democratic, practically?
Thank you for the...
In fact, all right, Jane, I'm so sorry for being rude about Canada and France. I'm married to a French woman, so I have a problem there.
By the way, in any other speeches, I'm only going to stick to the word democracy or democratic, not spread it out. It's a tongue twister.
It is indeed, yeah.
Thank you very much for your comments and your question. We'll start with Dr. Yahya and then Dr. Martinez, if you would like to join in.
Thank you, Jane. It's Maha Yahya, actually. Just to respond to the question is not just about democratic governance, quite honestly. I mean, let's go back a bit. It's today we're looking at a culture of impunity. Unfortunately, there's been a tremendous regression in fundamental human rights and issues of freedom, even prior to the 2011 Arab Uprisings. We're looking at, how do you stabilize a place like Syria whilst maintaining the person who's been accused for war crimes, i.e. President Assad, in place? I agree with you. The United Nations today is an issue because it is dysfunctional and is unable to take decisions based on the ideals on which it was founded. But it's still there, and it's one through which at least one can push certain agendas. I think for NATO countries, taking a very firm stand on the need to maintain, we're not talking about interference in specific countries, but any aid that goes to any country in the region has to be conditional on particular human rights standards. We cannot lose sight of the, if you want, the moral high ground on that front about maintaining a space for fundamental freedoms, including respect for the freedom of speech. Today, even places like Lebanon, we're seeing people being jailed for, a comment on social media over, criticizing the president of the republic. Meanwhile, people are dying of hunger. So I think there's a lot that can be done on that front. And that's not really about respect for international human rights, international norms, just international norms. I mean, to have a journalist killed in an embassy, that flies and violates every single international norm that organized around which international relations are organized. So I think these are fundamental issues that we cannot simply let go of. The question of the rights of Palestinians. Today, to my mind, the accords that we've seen happen, the bilateral agreements, are ones that have left the biggest question completely unanswered, which is what happens to Palestinians. The two-state solution is not one that is workable anymore. It's simply unworkable in the way it is now. So what's the way forward? And it's frankly looking for concrete ways to deal with these things rather than paying lip service to governments in the name of stability. And this is actually where also I have a lot of concern, that under the rubric of stability, European countries, NATO countries, and others have been willing to overlook some of these fundamental issues, which played a big role in the Arab Uprisings to start with. People didn't simply take to the streets because they were out of jobs. They took to the streets, let's just remember, asking for dignity, justice, and freedoms. Dignity is also about freedom. So we need to remember these things as we deal with these countries. I'll stop right here, and sorry if I took a bit too long.
Dr. Martinez, I'm not sure if you want to comment or not. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Yes. Thank you very much for these comments and the question. With regards to what can NATO do, first of all, is there a common vision of what NATO can do within NATO? For example, if we take Libya, which is a major threat for a country like Tunisia, which is a neighboring country, NATO has been involved in getting rid of Gaddafi, and we haven't seen NATO able to produce or offer a collective security solution to the Libyans, and we can see that this country was basically abandoned in 2013, 2014. And I believe that in this situation, if we really want to think about what NATO can do, even for public opinion in North Africa and the Middle East, for them to see NATO as an entity that is able to support them in developing institutions. I think there's an example that is still dramatic today, the example of Libya, and they should really serve as an example to make NATO more credible after the end of the Gaddafi regime. With Iraq in 2003 and since Afghanistan, we know that democracies rarely come after there's a regime change by force. We can see that the state is broken, and therefore it's very difficult to have a political regime. And we can see that there can be significant military coalitions, which is the case in Libya, but it's impossible to have a political solution for the citizens. So this means that citizens are there abandoned with militias, and then foreign countries that are intervene, that feel that there's a void from a security standpoint, and they can do whatever they want there. And therefore there's really a reflection that has to be done. There's this country that is waiting for us to restore collective security.
Our next questioner is Paolo Formentini from Italy. Paolo?
Can you hear me? I'll be speaking in Italian. Can you hear me? Okay. Our country is very close to Tunisia, and therefore I am interested in asking Dr. Martinez what he thinks NATO can do. What role can the NATO Naples hub for the South play, and what can we do in order to engage the civil society in a dialogue? And as a political and military alliance, how can we counter the irregular flows, or how can we help to fight these irregular flows of human lives. We are very disturbed by the situation in Tunisia at the moment. The island of Lampedusa, which of course is Italian, is only 167 kilometers away from the Tunisian coast. So, as always, Italy is the one that will be hardest hit when it comes to national security. And many people, again, will lose their lives in the sea while trying to come ashore on the European continent. So what can we tell these people? What message can we convey? How can we work together with these peoples in order to provide young Africans with a future? Now, our other expert mentioned the Palestinian question. So I would like to ask you, Dr. Yahya, with the new Biden administration, what do you see in terms of the new Abraham Accords for the future? And do you think that the new Palestinian leadership should cherish those accords? And do you think they should start with those accords in order to create a new Middle East in economic terms?
Very much. We'll start with Dr. Martinez.
We're having technical difficulties with Dr. Martinez.
Okay, we'll
so maybe
start
we can
with
go.
Yeah, Dr. Yahya.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, we've got
Yeah.
both. Dr. Martinez, go ahead.
Ok, merci. Merci.
Thank you very much for your questions. For your first question, as for Tunisia, as I said before, if we don't tackle the socio-economic problems, you'll have structural migration. If you're young, if you're under 20, and there's absolutely no future, no economic future, whatever the country, I mean, all we need to do is think about Europe in the 18th century when people migrated to North America because there was no future. So if there's no economic future for the youth in Tunisia, of course, they're going to go where it's closest to their country. And as you said, the closest countries are Italy and France. Because these two countries have about 60% of the Tunisian population in Europe. And it is obvious that if we can't provide them with concrete solutions, nothing will work. We can always send NGOs to try to tackle issues related to migration, to teach them about the risks related to migration and the dangers related to migration. I don't think it will be enough. Young people will not listen to these things because they feel that they have absolutely nothing to lose. And between taking this risk and staying in their country, well, they're going to take the risk of leaving their country. So it's really in our interest to make sure that the Tunisian democracy is there for the long term. And in order to fight against illegal migration, we have to support the Tunisians. I think we don't realize that changing political institutions is just the beginning of the transformation process. But the problem is that when we change political institutions, all of the problems are put on the table. When the government was authoritarian, everything was hidden, but everything now is on the table. The media, everybody can talk about the corruption of politicians, and this contributes to people being completely disillusioned. So what happened in Tunisia was also the beginning of all the problems the Tunisians are encountering today. And if we don't provide them any support now, I think on the side of Europe, we're going to have to face structural migration from Tunisia. And in Tunisia, the risk is that people are going to be significantly disenchanted. I'm not talking about other countries who are going to look at the experience in Tunisia and who are going to think, if democracy means that we have to have the same problems as Tunisia, is it really in our interest to have democracy?
Jusqu'où ce modèle va...
And we must wonder how long this model will stay if it's confronted to all these issues. So I believe all of these issues are very important in this context.
Shall I?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to say one word on Tunisia. I completely agree with Dr. Martinez on what he's saying. I mean, Tunisia is the apple of the Arabs and the eye of the Arab Spring. And I think we're all invested in seeing the successful political transition translate into an economic transition. It's incredibly important that that happens because it's not just about the failure of the model. Already Syria was kind of the big boogeyman for the longest time after the Arab Spring started in places like Egypt, like Jordan, across the region. The reaction was, no, we don't want to take to the street because we don't want to end up like Syria. That broke with the waves in Sudan and in Algeria and in Lebanon and Iraq and other places. However, it's still fragile, and the success in Tunisia is incredibly important, not I think only for the region, but for the world, to say that there is a successful and it is workable. Now, on the Palestinian issue, I don't think it's a question of you cannot dial back the clock. And in fact, the Biden administration has just put out its new policy or directive on Palestine. It put it out yesterday, and how they plan to deal with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So there's no dialing back on the agreements that have happened already, the bilateral agreements with the Gulf countries. I think what is important today is actually to take stock of the situation on the ground in Palestinian territories and really honestly say, does this two-state solution continue to work when Palestinians will not have any kind of, the territory on which the West Bank is completely punctured. When they say Swiss cheese, it really is Swiss cheese. Can you have a lasting peace if refugees don't get any kind of recognition one way or the other, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are lots of issues, questions around the status of Jerusalem. I think these are very thorny issues where there's a need for creative thinking around them, both in terms of confronting the realities on the ground today and where things are, but also thinking creatively. How can you have a lasting and prosperous peace in a region? And to my mind, that is only possible by recognizing the rights of Palestinians. Today, what we have is an apartheid state. I'm sorry, the way things are operating, and we have to call a spade a spade. The way things are happening only reminds us of that kind of a system. So I'll stop here, and I'll invite you to look at the new Biden administration's. So we've only got.
Oh, sorry. We've only got 10 minutes left. We've got 4 people who want to ask questions, so I've cut off the list. And so I'm going to get 2 people to ask questions. So if we could keep the questions and the answers succinct, that would be helpful. So we'll start with, so if you want to take notes to our presenters so that you can answer more than one question at a time. So we'll start with Sonia Krimi from France.
I will be speaking French. Hello once again. Dr. Yaha, you are right. What happened in Syria must not go unpunished, of course. It's necessary now to move forward to have a sustainable political situation. Then you spoke about the social contract. We know that in the Gulf countries there are a lot of private freedoms, the freedom to go as you want. However, the public freedom are still not an acquired fact. So how are we going to also fund what is going on there? There is the COVID crisis, and all of my colleagues know that our governments and at us as parliamentarians, we are the first ones to vote on these economic assistance, for instance. So if it's already difficult for us financially, I imagine it's even more difficult for all of the governments of the South Mediterranean Bank. And Dr. Martinez, I was thrilled to hear you speak notably about the 180,000 employees who have a weight on the public finances. You could you also saw what Nasser Afi did after he arrived in power. He did exactly the same thing. And when there is no sustainable political situation in these countries here, it's better to take a step back to better leap forward. And we see that when we really restructure our countries, we actually prepare the future. And my question to you is it too soon, 10 years after, to take stock? I believe it is. You also talked about the legitimacy of state. Maybe in some countries such as Lebanon, there is a request to have a more present state also. I would like you to also speak about the levers, and I hope that this GSM group, the Mediterranean group, with everyone here around the table, is a good example for exchange. We don't always agree, but we respect each other when we debate, and we also learn a lot from each other in this. And I will wrap up with France and the EU because I'm drafting a report at the moment. One of the conditions to the normalization of relations with Damas is the implementation of rights that are in line with one of the UN's resolution, the one we mentioned. And as for the social and economic situation, going to NATO here, it doesn't necessarily have an answer to that. I don't want to be devil's advocate, but it's true, we still, as members of parliament, speak a lot about these topics. But of course, this is not NATO's first goal, even though within NATO, we are also here to help towards stabilization and help on the security aspect. So once again, thanks to both of you, and it was a pleasure to hear you today.
We're going to have all four people ask their questions. So next on the list is Ahmed Bharat Chankar from Turkey. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Cordy. And I would like to thank to our speakers for this great panel. And as the rapporteur of the Mediterranean and the Middle East Special Group, I am really curious about the situation, especially about Egypt and Palestine, because these countries and this situation there is very important for the future democratic processes in the region, in the whole region. These two countries are very essential. So I would like to ask, how can we re-engage the governments or the states there to get into the democratic process? As we know, the Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt was banned after the coup d'etat. And in Palestine, we know there are two different, political parties, one controlling West Bank and the other one, the Gaza. So how can we get a democratic process going forward in Egypt and in Palestine so that we can really have a moderate parties which come from the Islamic, politics, to re-engage with democracy and to get stability for the region? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And our next questioner is Abdullah Ben Boulaid. Abdullah. Oh, I see you.
Qui va parler à ce webinaire dans c'est Tesri Rafika. Je suis
I am Tesri Rafika, member of the Council of the Nation. I would like to say a few words on Algeria. As you know, Algeria underwent a democratic process in 1988. There was a popular uprising then, and then we had a multi-party government. However, violent extremism was still there for 10 years. And currently, Algeria is still healing its wounds from then. And the security aspect is also crucial in our country when it comes to economic development. This is why human rights and the economy go hand in hand. So we needed to go towards dialogue, we needed to speak with the population, we needed national reconciliation. That was crucial, and that happened in 2005. And then in 2019, as you know, there was a popular uprising, a peaceful popular uprising. And it was a remarkable movement. Many citizens were asking for political changes. They were against the fifth mandate. They were against the prolongation of the fourth mandate, or they wanted a fifth mandate rather. And so there was a constitutional process that was respected. The head of government, indeed, prepared the presidential elections in December 2019, and then a president was elected with 58% of votes, and then he spoke about his electoral program. The constitution was voted via a referendum, and then on the legislative part, the assembly was dissoluted and a new assembly was elected. So by talking about this process, what I just wanted to say is that it's a very lengthy process, and I would like to also salute our Tunisian friends, and I want to tell them how they have to be ready. It's a lengthy process. And we had black years in Algeria, but I think you have to draw, or we all have to draw lessons from what happened in Algeria. We hear here that the army is being repressive, but in Algeria, the army didn't seize power. What it did is that it accompanied the popular movement, and they have respected the constitution. And this is what I would like to put forward. Talking about immigration now, I have a question. How can NATO help southern countries to contain migration flows? And we know that in Algeria there is a powerful migration flow. Every year, 200,000 migrants are found at the borders. Every year Algeria spends millions of euros. And with migration, with the pandemic, with people trafficking, money laundering, terrorism, all of these elements are intertwined. And of course, COVID hasn't improved the situation. On the contrary, because of the pandemic, this kind of cross-border criminality went even higher. And I think that maybe NATO could try and help us to control these flows. We all suffer from them. Merci.
Questioner or presenter is Lord Anderson from the UK.
Là, ça y est.
Ça y est, c'est le temps de la discussion. Ça va? Mais attends, tu m'as fait le...
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Excellent. No preamble, but three quick questions. On the Palestinians, can I take it that President Trump's deal of the century will not be carried forward by President Biden? We recall that the Palestinians were not consulted. Secondly, his population, which is at the base of many of the problems of the Maghreb, too hot to potato for the countries to deal with. What, if anything, can be done? Essentially, it is a women's issue, family spaces. Do we have to just sit on our hands and not seek to encourage a different population policy? And finally, I recall I was in Rabat once when we were dealing with regional cooperation, and at the very same time, Algeria erected various roadblocks on the frontier between Morocco and Algeria. What, if anything, can Europe do, which is something which is very much in our interests, to encourage regional cooperation when there are so many barriers between the various Maghreb countries? Thank you.
I know that you could probably spend about an hour answering these questions, but if I could ask you to be concise, and I know that Sonia is the rapporteur for the report, so perhaps if her questions haven't been answered, if you wouldn't mind if she could get a hold of you, I think she would appreciate that. Thanks. Go ahead, Dr. Martinez.
Oui, bien. Alors, rapidement.
Thank you. So, of course, the revolution raised hopes, many hopes, and therefore now the state should be able to produce more solidarity, especially in a situation of economic and social crisis. If there is no solidarity, there will be more migration, there will be protest, and there will even be a rejection of the political authorities. How can we do so? Via reforms. We've seen that in Tunisia there were attempts. I have a PhD colleague who looks at devolution within the states, and she says how it's very important to rebalance in all the countries this question of legal justice. And if we don't do so, then we will pave the way to more protest in the future. Secondly, today, there are two conflicts that represent real threats for any kind of economic development in North Africa. On the one hand, there's Libya, and then there is the stalemate in the Western Sahara. These are two very different conflicts, very different types of conflicts. However, they encompass a population of 100 million inhabitants, and these inhabitants must work together, and we have to find an economic solution for all these people. So first, in its neighborhood, in the different neighborhoods, they must find the necessary complementarity, and then when they look to Europe and other institutions, they must find in these institutions and countries people who will help them in these processes, who will support them in these processes. Otherwise, there will be more disillusionment in this region, especially among the young population, which would be a shame, especially in the 21st century.
Dr. Yahaya?
Thank you. Sonia, I'm sorry, but the voice went, so I missed your questions. Please feel free to send them to me via email, or we can chat on the phone and I can respond to them. But I don't know whether you asked me a question or not. But I'll respond maybe to a couple of issues that came up. One is the Palestinian question, which came from a number of the speakers. I think what is important here is almost going back to basics, reaffirmation of UN resolutions. We seem to have forgotten about those, the two UN resolutions related to the Palestinian question. I think reaffirming that the international community will not endorse two separate and unequal systems, irrespective of what the shape of the final state looks like, or the two states, whatever the Palestinians and the Israelis agree to. The bottom line is the international community will not endorse two separate and unequal systems for different kinds of citizens. I think also that perhaps supporting the Palestinian leadership as it undertakes its own reform, reaffirming the position of the international community on settlements in occupied territories, I think is also important. So there are lots of issues, and one can go further in terms of very concrete recommendations of what can be done and how the international community can make sure that whatever peace settlement happens there. Now, just to respond to the question of, is the Trump deal of the century? It was never a deal of the century. Trump kept announcing it as a deal of the century, but it turned out to be a transactional series of bilateral agreements with a number of Gulf countries and Morocco, and the components of that deal and the move of the embassy, the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, which is also important. There's no dialing back on these. These have happened. What the current administration is doing is saying, okay, we'll freeze movements on these. I don't think they will mind if new bilateral agreements take place between other Arab countries, other Gulf countries, and Israel. On the contrary, they would encourage this. But revamping the relation with UNRWA, reopening the Palestinian representation, there are things that they will dial back on when it comes to, and these are frankly low-hanging fruits in some ways. The tougher question really would be, what would really...
La question plus compliquée est ce qui permettrait d'avoir une paix plus durable dans la région.
Were really about the Palestinian question, at least to me. The other issue I would maybe, since I have NATO parliamentarians here, is make a plea for Lebanon, because again, if we're talking about security and stability, being in Lebanon at this point, I would make a plea to keep an eye on the country. The last thing the region needs and the world needs is another collapsed state. And the collapse here means conflict, chaos, etc. Keeping eye on Lebanon does not mean give freebies to the current rulers of the country, who, to my mind, at the very least, are displaying real criminal neglect for the country they've been entrusted to care for, but maintaining pressure for reforms to happen, but also working behind the scenes with the different international powers that are now involved in the Lebanon question. This is no longer an internal issue. It hasn't been for a long time, but even more so now. And this includes the Russians, the Americans, the Iranians, and everyone under the sun, unfortunately. But I think Europe is not being active enough, and it's not playing the role it can play, and this includes many NATO countries, obviously.
Thank you very much. These were great presentations and certainly great interventions from the floor. So I think I've certainly learned a lot from it. Dr. Mahaya, I have to say that nothing's private these days. So last evening I was on your social media account of Twitter, and for anybody, it's very easy to find out these things now. And I was struck by things that I didn't know about what's happening in Lebanon. And I did have some questions, but they'll have to wait for another time. So if anybody's interested, your Twitter account.
Feel free to send them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, they can join my Twitter account. Yes.
The presentations, the updates on what happened in the Arab Uprisings, or Arab Spring as we called it here in North America 10 years ago, has been very helpful. And the suggestions about what to do to bring stability or to maintain stability in the region, and that it just can't be political, because we can't just replace one repressive regime with another one. And I thought you both made that point really well. We need structural changes. Having been a former teacher, I was really pleased to hear about the education piece that you both mentioned, and more inclusive decision-making and economic changes. And thank you very much. It's been 2 hours well used and with a lot of information. So Sonia, I'm going to hand it back to you. I believe you're chair for the next session this morning, or this afternoon, I guess I should say. Go ahead.
Merci.
Yes, thank you very much, Jane. Thank you as well to our two speakers. We did learn a great deal and had this wonderful opportunity to have this exchange. So dear colleagues, after having discussed some of the internal developments in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, we're now going to focus on the dynamic of regional security, and especially on the means by which the Euro-Atlantic community can contribute to meet these security challenges in our southern neighborhood. So we're going to begin by listening to Joost Hilterman, who is the director for the MENA region of the International Crisis Group, and is a reference in his field. He has written, amongst other publications, for the New York Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the Financial Times, National Interest, Middle East Report. And I'll stop there, Doctor. I hope you won't mind. He is regularly invited to speak by major media outlets like the BBC or CNN. Afterwards, we are going to be able to listen to Dr. Jean-Louis Saman, who is a researcher affiliated with the Institute for the Middle East of the University of Singapore. He was before attached to the College for National Defense of the United Arab Emirates and is also a researcher at the NATO Defense College in Rome in Italy. He has also been a political counselor for the French Foreign Affairs, French Defense Ministry, where he has carried out a number of studies covering transatlantic military matters. Gentlemen, you are each going to have the floor for about 15 minutes, after which we're going to have a Q&A and discussion of about 30 minutes. I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Hilterman first and afterwards to Mr. Saman. And please make sure that if you'd like the floor, feel free, because I'm going to be able to give you the floor later. So, Mr. Hilterman, over to you.
Oh, there we go, to request the floor.
Est-ce que vous pouvez...
Could you please press on request floor? Excellent.
And thank you, everyone. Okay, here we go. I just give myself the timer so that I don't go over. So you asked me to speak about conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa region. And I want to provide an analytical framework that will help us how to understand these conflicts and how they relate to each other, where they come from, what drives them. Now, there are different ways of describing conflict drivers in the Middle East and North Africa, but roughly we can divide them between internally generated ones and externally imported ones. And of course, the conflicts that we see are a combination of the two in most cases. So if we talk about internally generated conflicts, and we already heard it from Dr. Yahya before, we're talking about issues of governance and legitimacy of the government, of the governments that exist, regimes or otherwise. And another internally generated conflict driver is interpretations of what role Islam should play in governance. And this is an issue that plays both among Sunnis and among Shias, who are the majority groups in the Muslim world and in the Middle East. When it comes to externally imported conflict drivers, we have those that were imposed in the post-Ottoman world by the colonial powers Britain and France, involving the governing orders that exist, that they put in place, and the borders that they created. And then, in addition, since then, we've seen a number of interventions by outside powers, be they of military nature or otherwise. And so these together, again, combine to create the conflicts that we have seen. Now, the Middle East and North Africa historically, since the Ottoman times, have had a certain internal coherence in terms of their state system. The Arab world, while divided in many ways, has had similar state system, at least states that reflected originally the British or the French system. So either monarchies or republics, but all the same, a Western European state system. And in addition to the Arab world, of course, there's Turkey and Iran. But 100 years later, we see that a great diversity has arisen. But these origins are still visible. But all the same, now there are many, many differences. And again, the conflicts that we see reflect these. Now, in order to divide it in another way and to understand the conflicts that we've seen today, especially since in the last 10 years, after some of the popular uprisings turned violent, I will give you 4 what I call clusters of conflicts. So these arose after the First World War. So first we go back to this notion of governing orders, where the externally imposed actually become internal factors for conflict because these regimes that were put in place eventually were completely indigenous and developed into, in many cases, autocracies with strong military dimensions and security dimensions, and often based on the income from oil and mostly oil in some notable cases. And these governing orders have come under challenge over time by popular uprisings. And of course, in 2011, we saw the biggest wave of these. There were some before as well, and there have been some after as
well, but 2011 was a watershed in this regard. And it was really, and we heard it in the previous presentations, a response to the inability of these governing orders to provide basic good governance and services without corruption and without a highly intrusive police state that denies people their liberty. And the same cluster, but I would call it 1B, is the question of the borders. Again, these were created 100 years ago, but we saw after 2011 major challenges to the borders, at least in Syria and Iraq, by both the Kurds and by the Islamic State, two entirely different groups, but they had one thing in common, which is that they both challenged the post-Ottoman borders created by the Western world. They didn't get very far. ISIS was defeated militarily. The Kurds were not encouraged in their quest. But those challenges are there. They haven't gone away. The ambition continues to exist. The second cluster has everything to do with the creation of the State of Israel. Started with the Balfour Declaration in 19, of course, 17, and then the creation of Israel in 1948, and the many conflicts that have come out of this, 67, 73, 82, and go on until the most recent conflict in Gaza or on the Lebanese border or the Syrian border. So this is an ongoing cluster of or family of conflicts that has playing itself out. The third one started with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And that revolution was a varied kind of revolution. It was anti-monarchical against the Shah and against monarchies generally. It was anti-secular. The Shah was secular. Of course, it was replaced by a theocracy. And it was anti-colonial. It was very much anti-Western, anti-United States. That was 40 years ago, and it's still very alive today. Not only was that created a number of conflicts in the region and between Iran and the United States and between Iran and Israel, but it also had a knock-on effect among the Sunni Islam, because remember, Iran, Shia Islam. But in the same year, a few months later, in 1979, some Sunni radicals in Saudi Arabia took over the Grand Mosque in Mecca. They were defeated eventually, but they set off a wave throughout the Sunni world where Saudi Arabia tried to preempt any further challenges to its monarchy. And out of this came eventually jihadist groups. And there was already a challenge within the Sunni world against the monarchies from Islamists who are not jihadists and of a different ideology within Sunnism, but who came together in a group known as the Muslim Brotherhood. And there are some other Islamists as well, but by and large, so you have Islamists and jihadists who are challenging those who may be very devout Muslims, but who want to separate the role of religion from governments. And you can look at the governments of Egypt today and the Emirates, who clearly make that separation, even again as they're very religious otherwise. So these are the four main conflict clusters, and they play until today. Today we see, for example, the conflict between Qatar and the Emirates, the United Arab Emirates. It's playing itself out not directly between them, but in battlefields in the Horn of Africa and in North Africa. But so it's very real today. And in addition to those four conflict clusters, we continue to see external interventions, whether it be by the United States, which of course we've seen on many occasions in the last 50 years, I should say, and most recently in the anti-ISIS coalition, Russia in Syria, and to more indirectly in Libya, NATO in Libya, of course, the anti-ISIS coalition, which also included European government. So those interventions continue, and they're not only by states external to the MENA region, but also by regional actors such as Iran, such as Turkey, such as Israel, such as Saudi Arabia and Yemen, for example, and such as the United Arab Emirates, especially in Libya. And Yemen. These are continuing as well. Now, if these conflicts that especially or some of them emerged after 2011, of course, the Israel-Palestine conflict has been of much longer duration. But also these new conflicts that we've seen emerge, these are not, if these aren't already bad enough, now they started to intersect. And that makes it very difficult to tackle them. I'll just give you very quick examples. In Syria, you see both the challenge to the governing system, the popular uprising against Bashar al-Assad, the challenge to the borders, both Kurds and ISIS, the Israel conflict. The Israelis are very much on the border trying to intervene against Iran, which is also the third cluster. Iran and the United States are involved. And there's an intra-Sunni one. The jihadists are very active. And of course, originally there was a Muslim Brotherhood issue in Syria as well, part of the popular uprising. And there is ongoing external intervention. In Yemen, I can also give you examples of this. In Libya, not as many of these factors as in Syria, but all the same, complicating efforts to resolve these. Now, what are the lessons that we have learned from this increasingly complex situation? First of all, that if we as the international community trying to deal with the region and trying to stabilize it, that if we address one particular driver of conflict, we may actually end up reinforcing others. And so that could backfire. I'll give you an example. Russia was trying to protect the Syrian regime from being overthrown. In doing so, it needed Iranian help. But by allowing Iran to operate side by side with itself, with Russia in Syria, it ignited a conflict that already existed between Iran and Israel over Lebanon, but now also in Syria. And so Russia, in a way, in trying to solve one problem that it faced, helped create another one, and it still hasn't quite resolved the first one. I can also give you the example of the United States and the anti-ISIS coalition in Iraq and Syria, where they needed Kurdish militias in order to defeat ISIS, but in doing so gave the Kurds support for their own agenda, which was to erase the borders for a greater Kurdistan, which they aspire to have. And that caused troubles with Turkey, of course, but also with the government in Iraq and with Iran, none of which want to see an independent Kurdistan arising in this area. And so, in other words, we have to be very careful when we start addressing a particular conflict driver that, in fact, we may make matters worse, or we just change the nature of the conflict. The second lesson is that there are no military solutions. We have seen no military victories of any significance, and only a redirection of existing conflicts. And I'm going to make a prediction now, just as give you one example, that, for example, the Houthis now are bearing down on the province and city of Ma'arib in Yemen. Maybe they will be successful in defeating the legitimate government that has its seat or has a seat there. But this is not going to resolve the conflict in Yemen. To the contrary, it will just create new knock-on conflicts. And so these victories in the end don't mean a whole lot. It certainly doesn't bring stability to the country. Third lesson is that there is no real conflict resolution possible. There's only such a thing as conflict management and mitigation of the drivers of conflict. We can prevent worse. We can contain the conflict. Now, there are different ways of doing so. There's the military ways and the diplomatic ways. Militarily, we can work with, and I think in NATO this would be a very familiar concept, is military hotlines to prevent a particular incident from exploding into something much bigger. And this requires very good and quick communication. And there's other mechanisms like that. On the diplomatic front, we can look at, we have very few mechanisms really, but the main one so far has been the United Nations and its special missions and envoys. And these have been active in Yemen, in Syria, in Israel, Palestine, in Libya, in Iraq, in Lebanon. But what we've seen is that they manage to contain the conflicts. They rarely help solve them. So in Yemen, for example, it was able to deflect a conflict over Hodeidah, but the Yemen conflict has proved to be too much of a challenge until now. And because these UN efforts have been insufficient, at times they get replaced or displaced by efforts by governments. Now, in the past, it used to be the United States as a sort of arbiter in the region, the most powerful actor, which was able to do this with financial incentives and the threat of violence. But now what we're seeing, for example, is that we have an Astana process between Russia, Iran, and Turkey, essentially displacing the Geneva negotiations. Supposedly they go in parallel, supposedly they don't contradict, but in a way they do. And Astana, it came about because the Geneva process excluded Iran. If you exclude a major power, then it finds a way in another way, and you offer an opportunity to other actors to use this opportunity. The second example, of course, is Russia and Turkey negotiating over Libya while there is a process going on through the UN in Berlin. And again, it's working in parallel, doesn't necessarily contradict, but it's not really clear how it reinforces itself. So just my conclusion, this is an analytical framework. It shows the limitations of any effort. It shows the limitations of any effort to resolve these conflicts, and the only thing we can reasonably hope to achieve is to contain these conflicts, to prevent them from metastasizing and create a much bigger war in the region, and to manage them. Thank you very much.
Merci, merci.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to give the floor. I don't know if you can hear me. Dr. Saman, you have the floor. Can you hear me? Yes, perfectly well. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Parliamentary Assembly for organizing this webinar. I'm going to speak in English, so I apologize in advance for the fact that I'm speaking English during this week for the French language.
Thank you very much to the organization for this invitation. It's a pleasure, but also a challenge to be next after this tour d'horizon from Dr. Hilterman. My brief will be mostly looking at Western responses and Western strategies 10 years after the Arab Spring, and trying to look at this last decade in retrospect and how the policy discussion on Western intervention in the region has been evolving. And to start thinking about the topic, I actually looked back at the timeline, and I was curious what happened exactly on the 18th of March 2011, so 10 years exactly ago. And that was actually the day, and I don't know if that had been mentioned at the beginning of the conference, I joined later, but that was actually the day when President Obama ordered the first strikes against the Gaddafi regime in Libya, and the UN resolution that had been supporting the no-fly zone had been decided a day before. So I thought that was, in a sense, a great timing to reflect on a specific decision, because I remember personally being, at that time, a policy analyst at the French Ministry of Defense, and that operation seemed like a major game changer, an unprecedented level, in a sense of Western intervention using principles such as the responsibility to protect. Now, 10 years later, I would argue, and that will be one of the main arguments here, that the Operation Unified Protector, the operation we've seen in Libya, was probably not the beginning of something, but in a sense the end of one chapter, the end of the era of ambitious Western interventions in the Middle East, or more broadly, Western interventions. This era had culminated with the war on terror in the previous decade, and we see now how, in many ways, this is very unlikely to be back into the discussion. There are several factors that explain this state of Western policy discussion on interventions in the Middle East region. In my view, the first factor is what we could call strategic fatigue. This is born out of the wars in Iraq, the wars in Afghanistan. Some of the elements that Dr. Hilterman was mentioning, the fact that there's a growing feeling that military solutions overall have been extremely costly and inconclusive. So a strong desire among Western governments for reducing their interventions, reducing their ambitions vis-a-vis the regional conflicts. You see that, interestingly, in the US over the last 10 years, first with the rhetoric of Barack Obama, actually 10 years ago, when he was saying it's time to focus on national building at home. And in a way, the rhetoric of President Trump on America First was looking at the same conclusion. This idea that it was necessary and it was in the interest of Western countries to get out of the region. And that led to the second factor, which is, in my view, the rhetoric of containment, which has been salient over the last years. If you look at how the discussion was framed in Western capitals, it was no longer about changing the region like it had been during the 2000s. It was no longer about changing the regime. Even on the Iranian issue, most of the countries were trying as much as possible to downplay the idea that Western policy was about changing the regime. And in a sense, you can challenge me on that, but I would argue that the majority of NATO countries, are actually now favoring the status quo in the region. And the nuclear deal with Iran, for instance, in 2015 is a good example on that. The deal was never about changing the region, changing the regime. The logic was to disconnect the nuclear file, the nuclear program of Iran, from the rest of the other critical issues, such as Iran's ballistic missile or Iran's regional policies. Most of the regional players wanted that focus, the focus on regional policies or the ballistic missiles, because they considered that this was the most important, most immediate challenge for them. But for Western countries, it was mostly about mitigating the impact of the nuclear issue on their own security interests. So again, containment. On Syria, interestingly, it was first about containing the spillover of the civil war. We didn't see any momentum, any significant momentum for changing the regime and so on, and that led to all the controversies about Western policies vis-a-vis the civil war. But even after 2014, when there was a shift because of the Islamic State, because of the rise of the Islamic State, and because it turned out that it was not possible to contain the problem, even after that, the coalition against the Islamic State was never about changing politics in Syria or in Iraq. It was about removing Daesh from that equation. Now that's it. And this is also, unfortunately, in a way, what fueled the misunderstandings about the Kurdish issue. This idea that the moment Kurdish forces were no longer useful for the fight against Daesh, they were no longer necessary. But that was driven by this idea of it's mostly about containing the region rather than changing it. The third point on the factors, which I think is also important, especially in a NATO context, is the prospects of a division of labor with regional partners. And that's a convenient narrative that you see in many ways in ministries of defense and also in ministries of foreign affairs. This idea that rather than allocating Western resources to the region, let's support regional partners that will do that on their own terms. This is the idea that officers use like capability-based approach, strengthening or helping local partners to help themselves or to take ownership of regional interventions. So again, a convenient narrative, this idea of no boots on the ground except trainers and military advisors. And so this combination of several factors, this idea of containment, strategic fatigue, and relying on local partners had three unintended consequences. And some of these consequences actually resonate with what Dr. Hilterman was discussing as well. First, at the local level, the outcomes of Western security assistance, be it through the NATO framework, be it through the EU framework, have been extremely modest. And that's a hard conclusion, that even this idea of strengthening the forces of our local partners is not really working at the operational level. And you see that in many cases, historically, the experience with Lebanon, experience more recently with training Iraqi forces, training Afghanistan forces. But we also see that outside of the Middle East, with the challenges that France and the EU are facing in the Sahel, with their efforts to strengthening the capabilities of the G5 forces. So this suggests that training the local forces is not an easy technical fix. This is not something that you can just do by focusing on tactical, operational issues that are that would be perceived as technical but not political. Actually, history tells us that a real security assistance means or implies significant involvement of the provider, so NATO or any Western country, into sensitive domains. Defense planning, force structure, civil-military relations. And eventually, when you discuss these things, you have an impact, or you interfere with the local statecraft. This relates to a second consequence, which was unintended, I think, which is that this growing reluctance of Western countries to intervene in the region led regional players to play a bigger role, but not always in the way that we wanted or that we expected. Regional players, and in particular Gulf countries, have been more ambitious and more assertive. And in many ways that has not aligned with our interests. The war in Yemen that Dr. Hilterman mentioned is a good example. 10 years ago, we were complaining in some ways that Gulf countries were free riders, that they were just basically relying on Western security guarantees and not providing anything for regional security. Well, Saudi Arabia, launching the coalition in 2015, made an unprecedented move. Unfortunately, that operation didn't provide any significant military results. We know the scale of the humanitarian tragedy, and even in terms of regional security, it could be argued that the state of security in the Gulf, and in particular for Saudi Arabia, is worse today than it was 10 years ago. When you look at the flow of attacks from the Houthis on Saudi territory. So this leads us to see how we had maybe misleading expectations on this division of labor, this convenient narrative of we support local actors, local partners that will take ownership of regional conflicts. And that led also to a third point, which is interventions of other external actors, and in particular Russia, that had been extremely quiet before that decade in the region, and that suddenly became a major player in Syria, where it had already a significant military presence, but maybe even more importantly in terms of the trends in Libya as well. So we see here how this growing reluctance of Western intervention in the region led to these unintended consequences. A short word as a conclusion, and you can assume from what I said that there is no realistic argument today for a return to operations like we've seen 10 years ago, operations like in Libya. For all the reasons I mentioned, but obviously also because of the current environment with the pandemic. I would doubt if we imagine a what-if scenario that if there was in 1 month from now the same scenario of simultaneous Arab uprisings, that there would be any appetite in Western capitals for intervention like we've seen in Libya 10 years ago. At the same time, that means that if we want to discuss division of labor, and especially as this is a NATO environment, first, I think NATO and Western countries involved in security assistance needs to have a better assessment of the security assistance. First, that is needed by the local partners, if you identify that local partners, and what is the end state? How far, how much is enough, and how far do you want to go into providing that security assistance, taking into consideration, as I said, that this is not just technical issues, that this will have political implications. And also another point, which is more about the political dilemma about Western reluctance, we have to consider and to acknowledge to a certain extent that if we want this division of labor, there will be this growing uncertainty regarding regional power plays. And the good example, as it was mentioned earlier, is the spillover of the Gulf rivalries. The fact that today in the MENA region, to a certain extent, the driving forces are the competition between Qatar, between the UAE, between Saudi Arabia, and how this affects other countries. So there, in some ways, we need to consider and to acknowledge this and to either accept this or change our view on Western intervention in the region. And thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. I want to congratulate you, as well as Dr. Hilterman, that I can't see anymore. Mr. Jost Hilterman, don't hesitate to request the floor so that we can put you on the screen and so that you can answer the questions that will be raised by our colleagues. I'd now like to give the floor to Ante Bacic. Sorry if I haven't pronounced your name properly.
No, you pronounce it very good. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Greetings from Croatia. And let me also thank all the panelists for their remarks on the matter. Now, let me just briefly point out one of specific issue that comes to my mind when we talk about the region. We are all aware that the security situation in MENA region remains volatile primarily due to economic, social, COVID-19 and other health threats, environmental issues, and the fact that the governments in the area remains generally poor. Specifically related to Africa itself, NATO's opportunities there derive largely from its partnership with the most important actors there. Here I want to precisely refer to Egypt as, in my opinion, by far the most important country in the region. On the other hand, African security issues may be affected by the increasing role of China and Russia that are playing on the continent. In recent years, China has demonstrated a growing willingness to participate in regional security provision in Africa. Russia, too, is tightening its military cooperation with African countries, among other states, the state arrangements. Russia provides some training assistance to Egyptian security forces as well. Furthermore, both Russia and China have established a permanent naval presence in the wider region, China in Djibouti and Russia in Syrian port of Latakia. In this way, if needed, both countries have the tools to cut off efficiently the Suez Canal as of the world's most heavily used shipping line. My question is therefore directed to Dr. Hilterman. What can the Western world, if I may say so, do to counter the position that is currently has vis-à-vis Egypt, particularly if we have in mind some reluctance by the Egyptian authorities when it comes to building some more corridor relations with NATO? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, chers collègues.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. I'll see if anyone else would like to take the floor, but I'll seize this opportunity and ask my own question before I give the floor to our speakers. On Russia, Mr. Jean-Loup Saman, you said that Russia was more and more visible, more and more present, but I would like for you to say a few words on China. We know that China is the first economic partner of Egypt, but also of other countries in this area of the world. But I'm now speaking of Nasser, and it's the second time I say Nasser in this meeting. I know that Nasser in the 50s and 60s was unhappy with the US. And as many military leaders in the Arab world, when they're not happy with a partner, such as the US one, they turn to other partners. That's what happened back then. And I would like to hear about what you think. I believe that these forces were always there in this area of the world. It's just that now these external forces are present in a different way, economically via the social networks and socially as well. Thank you. So I give the floor to Dr. Hilterman, followed by Jean-Loup Saman.
Thank you. I'm not entirely sure that I understood the question about Egypt and NATO, but generally the relationship between Western countries, Western governments and Egypt is very problematic because of the weakness and the fragility of the Egyptian regime even before the uprising, but especially after the uprising. So it looks very strong. But internally it is very weak because there is a lot of internal opposition, currently suppressed, but very much there. And at the same time, the government cannot really deliver services and jobs and anything else to a rapidly growing population that is, of course, predominantly young. And so the only way forward is to for the government to open up to some extent in order to spread responsibility for the difficult choices it will have to make in order to provide limited resources and jobs and opportunities to this population. But this government feels that it cannot afford to open up because the moment it does so, it will incur a response in the form of protests. And it doesn't want to go through another uprising like it did in 2011, which is deeply threatening, obviously. And so the Western world has a real challenge to figure out what do you do with a government that needs to open up in order not to collapse from its inability to provide for its people over time, and trying to support ways of opening it up that in and of themselves could also provide opportunities for people to start protesting again and bringing down that same government. In other words, either way, the situation is very difficult and not good, because either way the regime may suffer. On the other hand, it is not sustainable. The situation is not sustainable. So what do you do as Western governments? What do you do as a Western military alliance? I don't have an answer for this, but I do know that this is the real question that we all need to find an answer to.
Thank you. I will answer your question, and I will answer in French. So you were talking about China and Russia. And actually, I did want to talk about that last point. I wanted to speak of the growing intervention of the powers that are external to the region. And you were right in reminding us that historically Russia had been already present in the region. And in a certain way, we can assume that the Russian presence was more important during the Cold War than it is today. And over the last 5 years, what we are seeing is mostly the Chinese presence. It's interesting to follow. If we go back to 2011, the Chinese issue in the Middle East and the Gulf countries was mostly focused on the energy issue. It was way more limited in terms of trade or armament. And today, we see how the relation they have with China is more and more important, and in many areas, such as the new Silk Road. We are seeing that China is investing in port infrastructures in Abu Dhabi, in the Emirates. It's also contributing to the modernization of port infrastructures in Qatar. China is also in Oman. So we have this. We also have Huawei and its 5G that has gone into the region. And it's definitely not creating any problems in the region like it is in Europe. It's not seen by the authorities as a sensitive topic as it is seen in Europe. Then there is a health issue which has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And here China used soft power with the vaccine, for instance. So there's the Sinopharm vaccine, which is made available in a number of Arabic countries. Same with the provision of PCR tests. It's been done thanks to the help of China. And this leads me to ask, when is this going to create tensions? Either with NATO, but more specifically with the US. Because I believe that if there is a bipartisan consensus that we have in the US, it's the Chinese issue. And here we are in a zero-sum game. Either we have to side with the US or with China, in a way. And up to now, the Middle Eastern countries, and more particularly the Gulf countries, tend to ignore this problem, or at least they tend to diminish the scale of the issue. They are in a paradox that has no way out, because their economy depends on China. In terms of energy, now it's no longer Europe or the US, it's China, among others. And yet the security future is linked to it. And we see no short-term way out of this. Thank you for your answer, for your well-argumented answer. I hope that there will be more questions. I will first give the floor to Lord Anderson from the UK. And then I will give the floor to another person. Roxandra Bopal.
The other on Yemen. So far as China is concerned, the have suddenly become far more evident in the region. In Djibouti has been mentioned, where they have port facilities. They are building major infrastructure projects throughout the world, leaving large debts behind and buying support at the United Nations. To what extent are the countries of the region reliant or indebted to China, and what effect does that have? The other question is on the Yemen, poor Yemen, with a large population, and which I think we can look from our armchairs and say, as we've said earlier, that what we need is containment, and yet containment can be said at the same time as people are starving, people are dying. In what way does one see a solution? In what way can the people be fed and protected in that region? Is there any prospect at all of external intervention which allows perhaps even a pause for humanitarian assistance to the Yemen?
Merci, Lord. Merci, Lord Anderson.
Thank you very much, Lord Anderson, and I'll give the floor to Ruxandra Popa. Thank you, dear Chair. I will keep speaking French, and I will pick up on the fact that our two speakers spoke of two historical and strategic outlooks, two very different ones, which I think really feed into our debate. And I would like to ask more questions on this strategic vision in the long run. When I listen to you and when we have this region in mind, I have the feeling that Westerners have been trying, maybe since the French and British mandate, to get out of this region at different points in time. And then, for some reason, they are brought back to the region because our security is linked to the security of that region. And I feel that what we lacked, what we have been lacking is a positive agenda for this region. Every time they are being drawn back to the region for security issues, and that's a shame. It seems that they have only been drawn back for lack of a positive agenda in that region. So maybe what kind of positive offering could we have to the region coming from the West? And I have two other questions. It might seem a bit like a caricature, but I was wondering today, is there one conflict in the region that, according to you, could be key to opening positive dynamics in the region? For a while, Syria was a center of our attention. That's where all of the regional and international powers were concentrated. But I feel that now Syria is not that key. So is there another country, maybe Iran, that could provide to be the key that would open up to other positive dynamics in the region? And then a question to Jean-Louis Saman. I want to speak about the armed forces in the region. One of the hope of our cooperation in the region is centered on assistance and on security reforms. And we thought that through that, we could create within the security forces in this region, we could create allies to have a peaceful and sustainable transformation in that area. Do you think we could still hope? Do you think we could still have this in the future through NATO? Thank you. Thank you very much, Ruxandra, as well, for your questions, and thank you for being brief in your questions. I will give the floor to two more speakers who would like to ask questions. I'm looking at my two experts here. We have Jean-Louis Saman in Singapore, who's still awake. But I'm turning towards you. Is it okay? Can I still take two more questions? So if you don't mind, I will give the floor to the two other MPs who would like to take the floor, and then you will have a chance to answer these questions, if that's okay with you. Right, I will now give the floor to our rapporteur, Ahmed Bharat Chankar from Turkey, and then I will give the floor to Algeria, and if you can get ready for your questions.
Sonia, and thank you very much for this great panel, to our speakers. As the rapporteur of the Middle East and Mediterranean Special Group, I will be focusing on Iraq in my last report. So I'd like to learn how could NATO be instrumental in getting stability to Iraq. In what way can we focus our efforts as NATO member countries to make Iraq more stable for the region? And basically, I also see that one of the questions from Lufthansa was, which is the key country maybe in the Middle East to focus on? And in my view, it might be Iraq, because it has a lot of dimensions, with internal issues, Iran, United States, and other member countries, and all the Middle Eastern countries are in a way affected with the situation in Iraq. So I would like to you to elaborate on the situation in Iraq and what can NATO do to stabilize the situation. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le rapporteur. Alors, je donne la parole à Monsieur Abdelhak ou...
Excuse me, thank you very much. I will give the floor to Mr. Abdelhak Ben Boulaid or his colleague. Thank you very much. First, I would like to congratulate the panelists. These were extremely interesting briefs and speeches. I had a question. According to you, this security assistance, shouldn't it rather give way to a social and economic assistance? I believe there can be no security without economic development. So how could we bring all of these efforts together to go towards economic and social development? Once again, I maintain what I say. For me, there is no development if it's not a social development. Hello to everyone. I would also like to say a few words. I would like to speak about a simple observation. So there is the presence of Western countries in Africa and in Northern Africa and in the Middle East, and it's always a military presence, and this triggered wars and regional conflicts. And I would like to speak of a policy that was carried out 20 to 30 years ago by Western companies. They wanted to seek profit, and they relocated their companies 20 to 30 years ago towards Asian countries. Now, for the same purposes of making money, these countries such as Asia now have developed economically. And I'm wondering, had the Western countries carried out this policy in Africa, which is rich of many things, then maybe we would have avoided all of these migration flows and all of these wars. Thank you. Thank you. We now give the floor to our two panelists to answer these questions.
Monsieur Saman.
Je peux commencer si oui.
I will do the honors, says Jean-Loup Saman. I will start answering to the first questions in English since they were asked in English.
To answer all of them. Regarding China's and let's say the vulnerability of Middle Eastern countries vis-a-vis financial or the debt trapped, in a sense that China is reportedly using against other countries. And we don't know exactly because most of the time we don't have the details, the technical details of the type of loans or investment contracts that China and local countries negotiate. The main difference, though, between, let's say, Gulf states and African states, or even Asian states that are getting closer to China economically, is that Gulf states obviously have capitals that these other states don't. So the type of dependence or the type of rapprochement we're talking about is a bit different. Because in the case of Djibouti, there's an obvious asymmetry between Djibouti and China, but in the case of Gulf countries, they are less vulnerable in a sense to Chinese financial pressure. But the problem is more about the fact that they have a dependence, let's say, political security dependence on Western countries. So I wouldn't see a financial issue here, but rather a political one. Regarding the other questions, and in a sense, a lot of them were similar in trying to find a positive agenda or a way for Western countries to tailor their policy towards the region. That would be leading to resolution of the conflict. And I think Dr. Hilterman said that you don't solve the conflicts, you don't just manage them. Unfortunately, yeah, and maybe the more you study the Middle East, the more pessimistic you become. I don't honestly see any conflict right now that you could resolve. You can manage, you can mitigate the level of tension. For instance, with Iran, I think this might be one of the key right now. But if we want to be realistic, I don't think right now there's a window of opportunity to solve the Israeli-Lebanese conflict or even the Israeli-Syrian conflict. I mean, I don't see that like a breakthrough suddenly. And regarding the positive agenda, and which relates to, I think, the last question on security assistance, I think one of the problems is also what do we, I mean, and that will sound like a cliche, but what does the West or NATO want in the Middle East? We as citizens can be shocked by images of humanitarian crisis, shocked by authoritarian response to social mobilizations. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure as a citizen and as an analyst that there's anything NATO can do to solve that. I'm not sure that it could be effective, a NATO response, and that it should be a NATO response, because there's also an extremely negative perception in the region, a public perception that at the end of the day, NATO is the military arm of the United States. It's an imperialistic institution. We can invest as much as we want in public diplomacy to counter that narrative, but it is still a strong one, and not just among the decision makers, just among the local population. So the problem is, what do we want? And yes, it's also because we tailor our response with military resources. And it's similar to what we see in the Sahel, where we say there's a need to have both a military and a development response, but because of the priority, we allocate most of the resources to the military response, and this is only undermining the long-term need, which is on development. So in a sense, it has less to do with the region, the Middle East or the Sahel, than with our own governance of how do we conduct foreign policy. And again, to be realistic, I don't think this can be changed. I don't think we can suddenly move a lot of the resources on military to the development section, but this is probably the way to consider that dilemma.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jean-Louis Saman. I'd like to give the floor now to Dr. Joost Hilterman.
So first I should start by saying that I've really enjoyed listening to Dr. Saman today, and I completely agree with every word he just said in response to these questions. I would just say it in my own words. I give talks every so often to NATO fora in Naples or in Brussels or somewhere else, and I often get the question, what can NATO do in XYZ country in the region? And the only answer I can give is please don't do anything, because you can only make matters worse. Now, if you ask me about Iraq, I recognize that NATO is playing a role in capacity building in the military, and it's very limited, and it is clearly something the government wants. I think it's harmless for now, because the Iraqi military until now is harmless. It's not as repressive as some other militaries in the region, but that would be the limit that I would put on it. But otherwise, the problems are political, and the problems are socio-economic, and they're not for NATO to address. That is not the role NATO ought to be playing. And when there is a military problem that NATO can address, maybe arguably should address for self-defense reasons or otherwise, we need to be very careful as to how that response is shaped. And keep in mind that we're dealing with people who, of course, and I think Dr. Saman said it, see NATO as imperialistic and as representing countries that have long-standing interests in the region, not only defensively, but also extractively and otherwise. So it's a very heavy tool, NATO. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a raison d'etre. It does, but we should also use it with great care. Now, on the question of which would be a good conflict to, or is there any hope for a positive development? And I think that even though I'm not a great optimist, even when administrations change in the United States, that there will be a dramatic change, because there's a lot of continuity between administrations. There is an opportunity for some change, at least on the tensions between Iran and the United States under the Biden administration, and the possibility of going back to something that looks like what we had under the Obama administration with the JCPOA. And I think it's an absolute top priority to get the two countries back into full compliance with the nuclear deal as a stepping stone towards reducing regional tensions. Now, there is no guarantee that if the two sides come back to the JCPOA, that they will then be able to address regional tensions and that these will improve. So we just don't know. But I can assure you that if we do not go back to the JCPOA, regional tensions will worsen. And so we need to put diplomatic efforts behind the negotiations toward a return of the JCPOA. But if that succeeds in some way, and if there can be a parallel discussion about Iran's ballistic missiles, which of course the Iranians don't want to discuss at all, because they see that the Saudis and the Israelis are fully supplied by the United States, and it doesn't have any other conventional capability, or if there's a discussion about Iran's regional power projection, a good place to start is Yemen. And this is because, for two reasons. One is because the Saudis are tired and they cannot win this war. I think they realize they cannot win this war. I've had these conversations in Saudi Arabia. I know they cannot win it. They thought maybe that was the Trump administration behind them. They could still get something out of it. But now with Biden, they understand that this is not possible and they need to get out. And the Biden administration will help them get out, probably, to the extent that the administration can do anything. So that's one. And two, for the Iranians, Yemen is a relatively minor investment. It is a way to poke the Saudis in the eye, to keep them on the defensive, to let the Houthis shoot off some missiles into Saudi Arabia. Very unpleasant, but that's it. And for the Iranians, if there's a real effort to come to some kind of accommodation with the United States, then this is where they can tell the Houthis, well, you need to sit and negotiate in good faith with the Saudis and with whatever Yemeni parties there are that are cohesive. And of course, that's one other problem, which is that Yemen is now completely fragmented politically and geographically, and it's going to be very difficult to put, as the cliche goes, Humpty Dumpty back together again. There is some hope in Libya. We've seen that a new selected government has come to power, maybe a corrupt prime minister or whatever, but at least it's something, because it shows that the regional powers that have been competing have decided to step back. The Emirates have stepped back to some extent. The Egyptians are allowing to let these things go forward. The Russians are there only through their Wagner military security company. It's a minor investment. Turkey, of course, is heavily involved, but it is not opposed to this development with the Misrati prime minister. So I think there is some hope there, but also there's still a long way to go. And even a success in Libya is not going to unlock the bigger problem in the Middle East, which is still between Iran and the United States. So we go back to sort of the 2 out of the 3 main conflict clusters that I mentioned, the intra-Islamic one in Libya between Qatar and Turkey on the one hand and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia on the other. Maybe that can be lessened, and that's good news. The other one, Iran and the rest of the Western world, and of course Israel and Saudi Arabia, with the JCPOA maybe, but of course that's insufficient for Israel and Saudi Arabia. And then there's the Israel-Palestine conflict now in its 70 plus years, and absolutely no sign of letting up. Highly unevenly balanced relationship, where the Israelis can basically continue to build settlements, take land, and fight off whatever violence is there, which is really minor. Is destabilizing, but it's not something they cannot handle. And that will continue to contribute to this instability in the wider region. So we're far from out of the woods, and therefore it is, as Dr. Saman said, very difficult to be in any way optimistic about the future of the region in the immediate future. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. On that not so positive note, perhaps, we're reaching the end of today's session. I would like to congratulate Jean-Louis Saman for your work and for your article on at the time of cholera. It's like the time of the corona. I think we saw what happened in the Gulf. This was one of the first written works of literature on that, which connected things to the coronavirus and which was also quite specific about what was happening in the region. Thank you, Dr. Hilterman. I will continue to follow your writings and your work and your statements. It was a great honor to have both of you come and speak to us on behalf of all of our participants today. I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the time that you have given to us. We have now reached the end of this very important webinar. I just wanted to briefly recap the next activities of our group. Our wonderful rapporteur, Bharat, is going to prepare this year's report titled The Future of Iraq, Security, Stabilization, and Future Regional Part. And it will be presented to us during an unfortunately digital meeting in June. And then hopefully we'll be able to meet face-to-face in the flesh with our friends and colleagues, members of parliament from the MENA region, so North Africa and the Middle East. I'd like to thank our colleagues from Algeria, Morocco, Palestine, and Israel for the participation in this webinar. And I'd also like to tell you that the next seminar to be held in the flesh should be in Spain in October, but it's still a little too early to tell you the exact date, but we will of course try to finalize that as soon as possible, of course always following the situation with COVID. And thanks to the Spanish delegation and the colleagues for all the work that they've already done to set up the next seminar. And thank you to all four of our speakers again for their wonderful presentations. Thank you to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly Secretary for having set up this event. Thank you, congratulations. And thank you also to our interpreters. I know I tend to speak fast, says the speaker, who made it possible for us to communicate and have been outstanding. So thank you from the bottom of my heart as well. I know that it's a wonderful, challenging task to bring us together, because what would we be if we could not exchange these words? Thank you as well on behalf of the NATO PA to all of the members who took part, despite your very busy schedules, as I know. See you soon. And finally, we can also talk over the phone before June. Jane Cordy was saying that we can tweet each other and retweet each other so that we can at least put to good use all of these networks that we have, all the social networks. So I warmly recommend that you follow Jean-Louis Saman. He doesn't have a Twitter account, but you can follow him on his webpage. But he's a little hard to find on the online. And I certainly recommend that you follow Dr. Hilterman, because he has some absolutely incredible writings, and I read him regularly, and it's really great. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
Merci, au revoir. Thank you.